By 1973, Soul Train was not just a television show. It was a statement. Every Friday night, Don Cornelius walked onto that stage in his velvet suit, with that voice that sounded like it came from somewhere deeper than any basement, and he introduced America to itself. The real America, the one that had been making the music all along, while other people took the credit and cashed the checks. The show had been running for 2 years by then. James Brown had been on it. Stevie Wonder had been on it. The Temptations, Al Green, Curtis Mayfield, Aretha Franklin. If you were black and you made music and you mattered, you came to Soul Train. It was not optional. It was a homecoming. The one room where nobody had to explain themselves or soften their edges for an audience that might not be ready. Everyone in that room already knew. Marvin Gaye had not come. Not in 1971, not in 1972, not in the months after What's Going On rewrote what people thought soul music was allowed to say. Not after the critical praise, not after the sales, not after the conversations that album started. Marvin Gaye, whose voice had been the sound of Motown for a decade, whose face had been on more album covers than almost anyone alive, had not walked through Don Cornelius's door. People noticed. In the music industry, an absence like that is always noticed. And when someone as visible as Marvin is conspicuously not somewhere, the silence around that absence becomes its own kind of noise. The official explanation was scheduling. There were always official explanations. But the people who knew Marvin, who had been around him since October 1967, since that night at Hampton-Sydney College when Tammi Terrell collapsed mid-song and he caught her before she hit the floor, they understood that scheduling had nothing to do with it. Marvin had stopped performing live after Tammi died. That is the simple version of the sentence. The fuller version is harder to say out loud, harder still to sit with. The stage for Marvin had become a place where something irreplaceable had broken open and never closed again. He had been standing on one when the world he knew ended. He had held Tammi in his arms in front of a crowd that did not yet understand what they were witnessing. And in the 3 years that followed, 3 years of hospital visits and surgeries and the slow, grinding cruelty of watching someone disappear, the stage had accumulated a meaning that had nothing to do with music anymore. Every spotlight felt like a reminder. Every microphone, every screaming crowd, every moment of standing in front of people and being expected to perform joy when joy was the furthest thing from what he felt. It was all tangled up in ways he could not fully explain even to himself. With the night, Tammi's eyes went blank and her legs gave out, and he caught her, and the music stopped, and nothing was ever quite the same afterward. He could still record. The studio was different. In the studio, there was no crowd, no performance, no obligation to pretend to be someone who was holding it together. There was just the work. And the work during those years was some of the most honest music anyone had made. What's Going On had come from that isolation, from Marvin turning his grief and his anger and his exhaustion into something that other people could hold on to. But the stage was a different country. The stage was where Tammi had fallen. And Marvin, without making announcements or giving long interviews about it, had decided that the stage was no longer a place he could give himself to. Don Cornelius knew all of this. Cornelius was not a man who made uninformed phone calls. By 1973, he had built something that nobody thought a black man from Chicago could build, a nationally syndicated television institution that ran entirely on its own terms, owed nothing to the mainstream networks, and answered to no one but the audience that showed up every Friday night. He had done it through stubbornness and precision and a refusal to let anyone outside that room define what his audience needed. And part of what he understood was how much Marvin Gaye meant to them, how long they had been waiting, and what that waiting said about the relationship between an artist and the people who had carried his music through their own lives. He called Marvin. The details of that conversation have never been fully documented. What people close to both men have said is that Cornelius did not pitch it as a television appearance. He did not talk about ratings or promotional opportunities or what the platform could do for Marvin's career at a moment when Marvin's career could have used the help. He said something closer to the truth than any of that. He talked about the audience, about who watched on Friday nights and what they carried into those living rooms. about the fact that these were Marvin's people, specifically and particularly his, and that they had been waiting, and that waiting had a limit, and the limit was getting close. Marvin listened. That was the thing about him that got buried under the mythology and the tragedy and the years of difficult headlines. He listened. He was quiet in ways that made uncomfortable people read him as distant or cold, but it was not distance. It was attention. He was paying careful attention to what was being said and to what was underneath what was being said, which was usually the more important part. He told Cornelius he would think about it. Then he called back and said yes. He had conditions. This was also Marvin, and it had always been Marvin. He was not difficult for the pleasure of being difficult, but he was specific in the way that people are specific when they have learned what happens when they are not. He would choose what he performed. He would not be rushed by a television schedule. He would not be managed or softened for the format. He would come as himself, or he would not come at all. Cornelius agreed to every condition without pushback. He had expected conditions. Men who had been through what Marvin had been through did not come without them. The day of the taping, Marvin arrived, and he was not the version of himself that Motown had spent years packaging for the world. He was quieter than that, more interior. The people who worked on Soul Train that afternoon described him, years later, as someone who was carrying something heavy. They could not name what it was, but they felt it the moment he walked in. He was present and somewhere else at the same time. Both things were true, and neither one canceled the other out. The Soul Train dancers were professionals. That needs to be understood before the rest of this makes sense. They had danced through legends, through icons, through performers who filled stadiums. They did not stop for anyone. Moving was the entire point of being there. When Marvin started singing, some of them stopped. Not all at once. Not in a way that was obvious or dramatic from the outside. It was quieter than that. It was the kind of stopping that happens when something gets through the professional layer, when the body responds before the mind has a chance to assess the situation and remind itself to stay in character. A few of them first, standing still with their weight on one foot, just listening, then more. Then the energy in the room shifted in that subtle but unmistakable way that anyone who has ever been in a room when a performance becomes something other than a performance will recognize immediately. What had been choreography became something looser and more instinctive, closer to what people do in their own kitchens, alone when a song finds them at exactly the wrong moment and they have to stop what they are doing and just let it happen. Cornelius was watching from off camera. He had spent 2 years building enough professional distance to keep the production moving, even when something extraordinary was unfolding in front of him. You could not fall apart every time a great moment happened, or nothing would ever get finished. He had learned to watch and feel and hold it together at the same time. He fell apart a little that afternoon, just enough. Later, when people asked him about it, he was careful with his words the way he was always careful. He said that Marvin Gaye had reminded him that day why the show existed. Not for the industry, not for the ratings or the advertisers or the relationships that kept the whole operation running. For this, for a man who had not been able to give himself to a stage for years, walking onto one anyway, because someone had asked in the right way, and giving the people who had loved him the longest something they had not realized they were still waiting for. There is a specific kind of silence that settles in a room when a performance ends, and nobody wants to be the first one to break it. The silence that means everyone is holding the last few seconds of the thing before ordinary noise rushes back in. That silence happened in that studio when Marvin finished. It lasted only a moment, but everyone in that room felt it. Then the applause came, and it was not the polite, cued applause of a television production. It was the other kind, the kind that does not wait for a signal. Marvin did not linger. He was not someone who stayed to absorb his own triumphs or let himself be photographed inside them. He thanked Cornelius. He spoke briefly with a few of the dancers. Then he left the way he had come, quietly, still carrying whatever it was he had been carrying when he walked in that morning. The performance had not fixed anything. It had not resolved his complicated relationship with stages or with crowds or with the memory of what had happened at Hampton-Sydney College in 1967. He was not healed. He knew better than anyone that it did not work that way. But he had come. He had come without being reshaped by the format or the expectation, or the industry logic of what a television appearance was supposed to look like. And the people who had been waiting had seen him, and he had seen them, and for the length of one song, that exchange had been enough. Sometimes enough is the most that can be asked for. The episode aired on a Friday night, the way Soul Train always did. In living rooms across the country, people who had grown up with Marvin's voice heard it come back through the television speaker and felt something that resists precise description. Recognition, maybe, or the specific quiet relief of something you had quietly given up on turning out to still be there. Changed, marked by time, but intact, still capable of doing the thing it had always done. Don Cornelius ran Soul Train for 35 years. He never stopped talking about certain moments, certain afternoons in that studio that reminded him why the entire enterprise had been worth building. Marvin Gaye in 1973 was one of them. Not because of what it meant for the show, not because of industry validation or cultural currency, but because of what it cost Marvin to walk through that door. Because of what it meant to everyone in that room and to everyone watching on a Friday night that he had walked through it anyway. Marvin kept making music after that. Some of it was brilliant. Some of it was the work of a man who was struggling and making art out of the struggle because it was the only honest thing left to do. He never fully returned to live performance the way he had been before. The stage remained a complicated place for him until the end. But it had opened a little on a Friday afternoon in a television studio in Los Angeles, because one man asked the right thing in the right way at the right moment. And Marvin, who had every reason to say no, said yes instead. That is not a small thing. That is actually the whole thing. The footage exists. Most people who watch it do not know the weight of what they are seeing. They do not know how long it had been since Marvin had allowed himself to stand in front of people like that, or what was underneath every note he sang that afternoon. They just see a man and a microphone and a room full of people responding to something they cannot entirely explain, but cannot look away from either, which is, in the end, exactly what it was. Something that cannot entirely be explained. Something that just works. The way certain voices just work. The way certain moments between a performer and an audience work. Not because everything is fine, but because sometimes the music is the only honest thing left, and an honest thing, offered to the right people at the right time, is more than enough.